Hello, everybody, and welcome to our final webinar of the year. It's December 21st, the winter solstice, darkest day of the year, so it can only go uphill from here for the first next 6 months. But yeah, this is our last talk in the series, and I'm actually really excited about this one. So we're going to be talking about, I've called this the Modern IPA, but we're going to be talking about really tying together a lot of things that we've been talking about when it comes to developing new yeast strains and controlling flavor and biotransformation. And we're going to be wrapping it up in a little bow and delivering it to you for Christmas. We're going to be talking about the Modern IPA as sort of the end to our Flavor and Efficiency Toolkit series. And then we'll be back in the new year with webinars on whatever you want us to do. So if you've got ideas, make sure you let us know. So what are we talking about here? The Modern IPA. And the reason that I think this is timely is because IPAs have evolved. They keep evolving as a beer style. There's a lot of different types of IPAs. That now means that you have more choices than ever in the market to craft your own ideal hop-forward beer. You also have a lot of competition. If you're a professional brewer, a lot of other people making and selling IPAs, and yours needs to stand out. It needs to. So in this webinar, we're going to be talking about the Modern IPA. We are going to be focusing on yeast because this is an Escarpment Labs webinar. So I will be the first to admit I am not an expert on, dry hopping practices. I am not an expert on hop selection, but there are people that have fantastic educational resources. I am an expert on yeast, so we're going to be focusing on yeast, but we will highlight some of the areas where yeast interacts with the other ingredients and processes and what we think can help you to maximize the quality of your results, regardless of the type of IPA that you're brewing. So we'll talk about the current state of East Coast and West Coast IPA and how these have evolved. I have one person who says they can't hear me. I just want to make sure that we can be heard here. Okay. We're being heard. All good. So we're going to talk about modern IPA brewing techniques as well. So some of the new options that are available, that does include things like advanced hop products. Lots of really cool options out there now for you to play around with. We're also going to be talking about yeast options for modern IPAs because there's some new yeast strains out there. There's also some older yeast strains that can be utilized in really, really effective ways to make modern IPAs. We're going to talk about some of the recent science on Haze as well, which we did just cover in our Haze talk. But we'll have a little refresher here on Haze positive versus Haze neutral yeast and just yeast impact on Haze. We're also going to talk a little bit about how to use local and regional hops in quality IPAs. This is something that I would hear all the time from brewers is, I want to support the local hop farms, but I don't know what to do with this weird cascade. Well, if you have the right yeast, you can get some really, really fantastic results from local hops. So that's really, changing that conversation as well. And we're also going to talk about the importance of yeast nutrition in IPA. We've got a little bit on some of the, process quirks of IPA production as well, like hop creep. So why is IPA important? If you're a brewer, that might be the last 3 letters you want to hear because you're so sick of brewing IPAs. However, it is a really, really important beer style. IPAs account for anywhere between 40 to 60% of craft beer market share. And in a lot of cases, the top growing brands are in fact strong IPAs. So there's some examples like I know the Voodoo Ranger series from New Belgium, and especially this Juice Force. Sounds like it's done a really, really good job in the market. And that's a pretty high strength, juicy IPA. People seem to like it. And then here in Ontario, the top selling craft beer is this IPA called Juicy Ass from a brewery called Flying Monkeys. So very clear that this is something that the consumer's desiring. People are going after IPAs still, even as the IPA itself has evolved in some cases from something that's a little bit more resiny, dry, bitter to something that's more juicy, fruity, tropical. So, as I said, we're going to focus mostly on yeast. However, there are some other awesome resources out there. I would always steer anyone who's curious to learn more about, the science under the hood of IPAs to this book. That's by Scott Janish, The New IPA. It's a pretty fantastic resource. You can also check out his blog. He's been continuing to write these really, really great deep dives into, scientific topics as it pertains to brewing hoppy beers. So, how has the IPA evolved over time? We're not going to dive into this too much. I'm not going to tell you the story of beer being shipped from England to India and having to survive the journey. That's a thing, but that's very, very old. We're really here. We're talking about the American IPA, which has now become kind of the globalized IPA. So this really kind of starts in the U.S. as an ale with a high hopping rate, kind of adapting the English IPA style beer. Where things really innovated was the use of American bred and grown hops. So varieties like Cascade, Centennial, and Chinook adapted well to this style. You could make a beer that was really, tasty, had a nice bitterness, had a nice citrus and resiny quality using those C hops, and it took off in popularity. You have beers like Sierra Nevada Pale Ale, Torpedo, that really just became synonymous with craft beer, and that whole, explosion of craft beer that we've seen over the last 20 or 30 years. And then over time, the IPA, basically being a hop forward ale, has developed into regional styles and sub-styles, evolving alongside ingredients like new hop varieties. We've had new hop varieties that have come along like Simcoe and Citra and Sabro that have revolutionized and changed the IPA, as well as processes. Over time, dry hopping rates have gone up, so that's made flavor intensity go up. Dry hop timing has changed. Flavor preferences have changed. As I said, we're seeing a shift in consumer preferences towards the less bitter, juicier, softer kind of beers versus the dry, bitter, resiny, citrusy. Although, a lot of these, there's a whole lot of different types of IPAs in the market, and a lot of them are successful. And, to the point where we are today, where the North American IPA or American IPA and all of its different sub-styles are fully globalized. You can walk into a brewery in Sweden and get a hazy IPA. You can walk into a brewery in China and get a West Coast IPA. These things are everywhere. So it's become a almost synonymous with craft beer globally. It's that important. So that's why I'm talking about it. So, one of our fundamental divisions is the West Coast versus the East Coast, our Biggie versus Tupac of basically clear IPA versus hazy. I don't think it's necessarily that cut and dry. There are decidedly East Coast IPAs that aren't super hazy. There are decidedly West Coast IPAs that do have some haze and some juice, but this is one of the fundamental divides that we have in the IPA. Now, that kind of stands to this day, where you have the classic sort of West Coast IPA that's clear, it's dry, it's got a lot of hop aroma, a lot of hop flavor, but not a whole lot of sweetness. It's kind of designed to just give you as much hops as possible in a fairly drinkable format. Whereas the East Coast IPA tends to be a little softer, less bitter, tends to have more body and more residual solids or haze, suspended solids like we see on the right hand side. But not exclusively. Like, there are some classic East Coast IPAs that have quite a lot of flavor that aren't necessarily super hazy. So where is the IPA heading? And then we're going to actually dive into some technical stuff that helps you take the IPA in the direction that you want to take it in. So there's a few different directions that I'm seeing with the IPA. IPA finds a way. It always does. It hasn't died. It probably won't die for a very long time. So let's get used to it and take it where we want to take it, whichever direction that may be. IPA is going bigger and juicier. That's unavoidable. You have the beers like that Juice Force just dominating the market. There's clear demand from consumers for these double and triple IPAs. Weirdly enough, people seem to like to buy triple IPAs in the gas station. So the market has shown that that's a valid business model. And really the name of the game with these beers is more hops, more flavor, more aroma, seemingly larger cans as well. So it's kind of an interesting trend to observe. I'm definitely not the consumer of a tall can of triple IPA, but someone's out there buying it. So This is definitely a thing, and especially when we get to the juicy beers, flavor is really king, and just maximizing that aroma, maximizing those tropical citrusy characteristics. I think that we're going to be looking for more of that in the future. But on the other hand, you sort of see this rebellion of crisper and lighter IPAs. You have something like the cold IPA, which I think is not necessarily end all be all of this idea, but a really good starting point of trying other yeast, like trying lager yeast and fermenting colder, to make something a little bit crisper and almost like a hybrid between a lager and an IPA, and really maximizing the drinkability. And I think that this direction has a lot of potential. I think that there's a lot of people that don't want to drink like a 7 or 8% IPA. They want something that's drinkable, that's not going to get them super messed up, but has a lot of flavor. Like, people like hop flavor. So if you have these beers that maximize drinkability, they have hop flavor, maybe they're lower in ABV, maybe they're 4, 5, 6%. I think that type of beer, especially if it's not extremely expensive on the market, can evolve to compete with some of the macro lockers, even if it's commanding a price premium. So it'll be interesting to see if some of the craft brewers decide to take that strategy up. They can try to make Miller High Life knockoffs, but they're probably not going to make it as good. But they have an opportunity to make really tasty, lighter, hoppy beers that really could carve out a place in the market. So I do think that that's a way that we will see the IPA evolve. Not saying that you end up with something that's totally a hybrid of American adjunct lager and IPA, but I honestly think that the market would respond well to that. And then we also just see exploration, continued experimentation, exploration of new flavors, new processes. You have new hops that come out. Like, I'll use Sabro as an example of a hop that came out, and I think I know that it's divisive. People don't always like it, but you can't say that that's not a unique hop. It has absolutely unique character, and we'll see more of that come as hop breeding programs continue to deliver results. And we're going to continue to get really interesting flavors out of new hop varieties. And that's gonna, every time that happens, there's basically a new new set of flavors that brewers have access to. And we're also seeing that with new yeasts. So it's never been a more exciting time in the yeast world. New strains coming out seemingly all the time with new capabilities, whether that's more pineapple ester, whether that's tropical thiol release. There's a lot of opportunities to innovate with yeast, and that's also why I'm talking about yeast here with the future of the IPA. Okay, so diving into the technical details with our modern IPA, and there's just some things that I want to highlight that I think should be thought about. And I am going to reference some of our past webinars in this series just to show how all this ties together. So something to keep in mind when you're building a grain bill for an IPA. And again, I'm also not a brewhouse expert, so I'm not going to get into too much detail here. I'm going to try to provide some guidance. One thing to watch out for in the IPAs is that your fan can get too high if it's all malt. If you're making like a double, triple IPA and it's all malt, you can end up with a pretty high fan. And if you remember from the off flavors video, if fan is too high, you can run the risk of fusels. You can also run the risk of VDKs or diacetyl being present and persistent in the beer as well. So, you don't want too little fan, because then your yeast is going to be stressed and sulfury. But if you have too much, it's also an issue. So that's something to watch out for. And it's actually an argument for using adjuncts or using sugar in the recipes. So if you look at the West Coast, for example, a lot of those have sugar. They'll have like dextrose or something added to them. It does lighten the beer, but it also does help to keep that fan in check and keep that yeast flavor profile very clean. Something to watch out for with the modern IPAs, a lot of people use oats to add body, add that sort of fluffiness to the beer. Something to highlight with oats is that they actually are foam negative in a lot of cases because of the fatty acids found in those oats. So if you are looking for a really, really good foam in your IPA, that is something to be careful about. What you can do is balance it out with wheat. So conversely, wheat, in my experience, can actually reduce the body, but wheat is very foam positive. As you can see in the graph on the right-hand side, wheat can give you a lot of benefits for foam. So one suggestion that I would make for building a grain bill for an IPA would be, if you're including oats, also include wheat at a 1-to-1 ratio. So you could keep it like really simple. Like we could just say, 70% of your base malt, 10% oats, 10% wheat. A lot of brewers use flaked oats. Malted oats are becoming more popular. You've got some options there for sure. Like the main difference between flaked and malted oats is going to be, your base malt's going to convert the flakes anyway. So the big difference is that with flaked oats, your starch has already been gelatinized, which are partially gelatinized because of the friction from the roller. So that can sometimes make it just a little bit easier to handle because you do get a lot of these kind of gummy sugars, polysaccharides coming out of the oats. So with malted oats, you might, you're basically achieving the breakdown of that starch in a different way. So I would just try both and see which one you like the best. When we get into hop selection, and obviously like this could be a whole, hour, 2 hours, 3 hours on its own. I'm going to kind of keep it a little bit simplified here. But typically for most brewers making IPAs, they are selecting, for a certain flavor profile, as well as they're selecting for, a certain amount of biotransformation. So obviously there's a ton of hops out there with really cool flavor profiles, aroma profiles that I haven't included on these lists. I did just want to highlight some hops that I think are good selections for either just for like a base profile of your beer or for biotransformation purposes. Obviously it's hard to make an IPA with like Sots or something like that, or East Kent Goldings, unless you're making like an English IPA. And there's a lot of new hop varieties that I didn't mention here, but we're talking yeast. And when we're talking yeast, we want to make sure that we're including some ability for that yeast to do what it does and biotransform some of those hop compounds, give you something more. So if you are looking to design a modern IPA recipe, you can use what we know about biotransformation science and be really intentional about it. So, for example, if you've got a yeast that's good at terpene biotransformation, and you can go back to our video on biotransformation and flavor production, and you can find out which yeasts have that capability. But you can select hops like Centennial, Cascade, Chinook. I just talked about those. Those have been around forever. They can be a little bit boring and generic, but if you combine them with a yeast that can do the terpene biotransformation, you can get a pretty different flavor profile. We can have Centennial, Chinook come out extremely citrusy with the right strain, and then newer hops like Strata too. Like that's a hop that to a lot of people just smells like weed, marijuana, but with the right biotransformation, it can become almost like mango. So there's a lot of potential with the hops to get biotransformation. And then our other type of biotransformation, thiol biotransformation, we have potential there too. So with some of the new yeasts that are available to perform thiol biotransformation, we also have hops like Cascade and Calypso that are, a little bit underrated. Maybe they're not as, as desirable on paper as something like Citra, which like if you put Citra in your beer, you know what you're going to get. You're going to get Citra. You're going to get a lot of thiols, but you're going to pay for it. Like that's what you're paying for with these hops like Citra, Nelson, Mosaic. It's free thiols. So you can use yeast and get some of those free thiols effectively for free, which I think is pretty cool. So being able to play around with yeast strains that have capabilities for thiol biotransformation allows you to also modify the flavor of those hops. So, don't think that you have to only use Citra Mosaic in your IPAs. I think that gets a little bit tired, and I hope that you're inspired to experiment with different hop varieties in combination with different yeasts, because at the end of the day, there's a lot of Citra Mosaic IPAs out there, and the guys with the big bucks are going to select the best stuff. So it's really hard for you to compete unless you're getting creative. Timing is important too. We've talked about this a couple times, but I do want to highlight just some strategies for hop timing for biotransformation. So with the terpenes, you want to get those into solution. So one of the best places to get the terpenes into solution from your hops is still on the hot side. So your late kettle edition, your whirlpool edition, or your early dry hopping can help too. That's how you're going to best solubilize your terpenes, both just for flavoring your beer with terpenes and for providing biotransformation precursors. So if we're looking at hops with high terpene content, like the C hops, Those work great early on, like in the whirlpool, for example. You also can get some biotransformation of terpenes with the early or mid ferment dry hopping as well. Although, in my opinion, it's easier just to load those in the late kettle or the whirlpool. So if I was making an IPA recipe, I would probably, I would look maybe include some C hops. I might also include something like Mosaic or Citra in the whirlpool as well. Strata is one of my favorites. There's some newer options too that we haven't had a chance to play around with. But really load that up. And if I've got a yeast that can do good terpene biotransformation and turn the floral aromas into citrusy aromas, which you can learn more about in our other videos, that's where I would do it. With thiols, you have to be a little bit more strategic. So if you're trying to release bound thiols, weirdly enough, the earliest you add the hops is actually best. Mash hopping allows you to extract the most biotransformable thiol precursors. You can also do it later in the kettle in the whirlpool. And then when you have those thiol precursors in the wort, the yeast can break them apart and turn something that's flavorless into something like grapefruit or guava. But if we're trying to maximize the unbound thiols, so we're using those hops like Citra, Mosaic, Nelson, etc., Sabro, we're probably going to do that through dry hopping because a lot of those really, really high intensity hops, that's part of what you're paying for is these really delicate aromas like thiols, for example, or even some of the esters that are found in hops. You don't want to be adding that super early because the fermentation might even blow that off. So that's part of the reason for a hop like Citra being really desirable as a dry hop, either mid ferment or post ferment. And we'll talk a bit more about dry hop timing as well, and some philosophies around that for IPAs. There is some opinion here, just to warn you. And one thing that I do want to bring up is this question of mid fermentation dry hopping, because it's so common, and we have to ask the question and be a little skeptical of is this actually have any effect? It's a little bit challenging that this gets the act of putting hops into the beer halfway through fermentation gets conflated with the actual scientific principle of biotransformation, because yes, you can get some biotransformation, but they're kind of different things. You can get lots of biotransformation without dry hopping at all. If you look at the actual conversion of aroma compounds, I'm not saying that that's not a thing, but we have to break that down and understand what is actually going on if we are doing a mid ferment dry hop, because it is such a common practice in IPAs, and a lot of people do swear by it. So if we look at least the science that's available, and I recognize there's a lot more science to be done, there's no clear evidence that biotransformation is enhanced by mid ferment dry hopping. Doesn't mean that this practice doesn't make any difference in terms of sensory. So there's a couple studies that have been shared that I think are really, really helpful here. So Sierra Nevada had a study where they did show a sensory or analytical difference between dry hopping methods. So here, for example, they're green and yellow are basically like early ferment addition versus a kind of mid to end ferment addition versus a fully cold addition, like fully post ferment, post crash dry hop in red. So you do see a difference there where the hops added earlier were giving more of a fruity tropical profile. The hops added after cold crashing were giving more of a dank profile. So you are seeing probably some evidence of some of that biotransformation there. Although in this case, I would interpret that warm to cold addition as being somewhat similar to what a lot of brewers do, where they'll, wait until day 6 or 7, final gravity is mostly there, crop some yeast, add the dry hops, versus like what I would call a mid ferment dry hop, where you're often adding it like day 2 or day 3. That day 6, day 7 addition tends to be a lot easier to manage from a yeast management perspective. And there's another study from New Belgium where they did show analytical differences between these dry hopping timing, mid ferment, late ferment, post ferment, but they didn't see any sensory difference. So that was kind of interesting too. One thing they did see that I thought was interesting is that with the mid ferment dry hop, they actually saw, I believe, a lower amount of myrcene, which is important because that is a terpene compound. It does have flavor, but it also can contribute to the taste of the beer as well and contribute to hop burn. So I know one thing that might actually be happening with the mid-ferment dry hop is that the hops might be interacting with the yeast, and the yeast might actually be stripping out some of the compounds that we don't like from the hops that might contribute to something like hop burn, which is, it's when you take a sip of a really hoppy IPA and it kind of lives a burning, kind of lingering, almost like garlicky thing, which can be unpleasant. Some people like it, some people don't. So there's some evidence there, but from a purely like flavor production standpoint, there's not a lot of solid evidence that adding dry hops halfway through the fermentation is improving the outcomes. Although I'm excited to see more research to see if this can be proven wrong. So another thing that we have to worry about or think about with a modern IPA is hop creep. So we've got a whole video on this if you want to check it out. So I'm not going to dive into like all the details of hop creep, but it's a pretty significant issue now because of how much hops have changed. The kilning temperature of the hops have changed to the point where the enzyme content of the hops is different. So consequently, they tend to have more enzyme content and can actually have some amylase activity and create a secondary fermentation when the hops are combined with the yeast. So consequently, this is something we have to think about with the IPA because we're adding hops that are now processed differently that have enzyme content, and we're adding a lot more of those hops. So it becomes a pretty relevant factor in our fermentation. You can see here an example of hop creep where, if you have hops and you have yeast, you can have a pretty significant amount of residual fermentation in your beer. And I think this is packaged beer because you see it happen over 40 days, but it's a pretty significant challenge for some of these beers. So what can we do to avoid hop creep entirely? I just took this straight up from our hop creep talk, and you can go over to that if you want to learn more. But you do have some approaches, some options, because it can be a real efficiency boondoggle for your brewing. Practices like dip hopping, so basically preheating the hops, that will inactivate the enzymes, although you run the risk of losing some flavor. It's a great opportunity for advanced hop products. They keep getting better. I've had some experience with this Spectrum product from Barth Haas, which is, you can kind of think of it like a liquid dry hop. It's pretty awesome. It doesn't get you 100% of the way there, but it gets you most of the way there. And it's like a liquid that you can mix into your beer and pretty easily get into solution, which is kind of cool. And it sounds like there's more of this kind of stuff coming online as time goes on as well. Or you can just do the old school way and dry hop post ferment, post crash, after yeast dump. One of the classic ways that people made IPAs 10 years ago, and we're starting to see a return to that, is let the beer finish fermenting, let it clear diacetyl, crash it down to 16 or 60 Fahrenheit, dump the yeast, dry hop. However, that still can cause issues if the beer gets warm stored and, the yeast hasn't been fully removed, because you still can get some of that residual fermentation and hop creep. There's also the opportunity, some products coming online to just inhibit the yeast post-fermentation, which can also be an elegant solution, although I haven't seen a ton of solid data on those types of products in this application yet, so I'm not citing them. So what yeast can we select if we're kind of looking for the classics? These are what I would call the classics for, at least from the Escarpment Labs catalog, for the IPA. Cali Ale is like the classic, California Ale Chico. That's a famous strain that has been used to make probably more IPA than any other yeast strain on the planet. It's tried and true, and it does what it does. It makes a nice, dry, clean West Coast IPA. Another really common strain is the English Ale 2, or like the Whitbread family. One of the benefits of this is that it's a super flocculent strain, which makes it a lot easier to crop the yeast. Even if you're dry hopping early, you can crop this yeast off like day 2, day 3. So for that reason, it can become really, really beneficial for yeast management in a professional brewery standing. Vermont Ale, maybe a little bit more of a recent entrant, but especially early on in the development of New England or hazy IPAs, this became a very popular strain. It's kind of famous for its peachy flavor profile. Also famous for being a little bit of a prima donna, a little bit finicky. So, you get some nice flavor, but it also can be a pain. It tends to be favored by, in my experience, by larger breweries. It's really, really easy to crop and repitch. It works a lot like Cali. It's very, very similar functionally to Cali. So those that were kind of born and bred on Cali had a really easy time transitioning over to a strain like Vermont. And then Foggy London Ale, which is, I would say, is probably the most popular yeast strain for IPA today, with the popularity of the hazy IPA. This is a haze positive yeast. It makes it easy to achieve haze, and it also has a nice flavor profile, leaves a nice rounded profile. So it's one of the more ideal yeasts for the hazy IPA because of all of these properties. Although there's other options too. American Ale is a strain that's similar to Cali Ale, but with lower attenuation. It's almost a compromise between Cali and Foggy. So we often will recommend that to people making IPAs. There's also Cerberus or Sactois. Kind of became a famous strain in the mid 2010s. It's kind of fizzled out more recently because it is a diastatic yeast, so there is a risk of cross contamination when using that strain. But it offers a lot of flavor potential, so we often use that strain as a parental breeding line when we're making new yeast strains for that reason. And also Kveiks. There's a huge diversity of Norwegian Kveik yeast, and a lot of them have potential applications in IPA beers. Don't discount the Kveiks. Just because you tried Kveik once and didn't like the profile doesn't mean that this whole family of yeast is no good. I encourage you to explore and try other options because there are people out there making award-winning IPAs. And, for those of you who think that Kveik has a very specific flavor that you can always taste, you wouldn't be able to taste that in these beers. They just have, rounded, lovely profiles. They might have some tropical fruit. They might have some pineapple. It all comes down to how you handle the yeast and how you know the yeast. And to that end, we've also been doing a lot of work developing new yeasts for IPA. So you can go and check out our video where we talk about how we make new yeast strains for the IPA. And it's important to us because as a style, the IPA is so dominant that there's a need for more yeast strain diversity. It's a potential problem if every single brewer is using the exact same yeast strain to make all their beers, because at that point, what I'm sorry to say, but what makes the beer unique, right? If we're all using the same yeast strain and we're all using Citra and Mosaic to make an IPA, then all we have left is technique, and that's going to be a really hard way to differentiate yourself. And I guess marketing is important. Looking at this differently, we do see opportunities to develop new yeast strains so that you can make IPAs that stand out in a crowd. We're always looking for specific targets, whether that's functional or flavor targets. So we know haze is important, so we're looking a lot at haze control, whether that's a haze positive strain or a non-haze positive strain. Again, with something like hop creep, diacetyl becomes a way bigger risk. So we're looking for strains that have less risk of diacetyl, just to make things easier for the brewer. And we're also looking for specific flavors. There's especially as the IPA has trended toward fruitier profiles, yeast strains that can produce peach or pineapple or citrus or mango, guava, vanilla, or aromatics. And there are yeasts out there that can do all these things. They become really desirable because then we can amp up or complement the flavor of the hops with the flavor of the yeast, versus an older school approach, which might be to use a very neutral yeast and pair that with intense hops. You can kind of get a little bit of a more is more, or an additive approach. 1 + 1 = 3. If you're using a yeast that has strong aromatic components alongside hops that do. Another opportunity is to match attenuation of the yeast to the brew house in the process. So what we find is that for any given strain, the actual attenuation that we see in the brewery can vary widely. It can be 15-20% of a delta between one brewery to another. Maybe the average is somewhere in the middle as the average, but the actual process and brew house technology that breweries have or home brewers have can vary widely, and that will radically alter the type of fermentation, attenuation, flavor profile that you might get. So another reason to have diverse yeasts for IPA is that there isn't one single strain that's going to work for every single brewery perfectly. It's nice to have different options because, you know, 65% attenuation in one brewery might be 80% in another. And then, whatever you're targeting for your beer in terms of balancing the flavor profile, you'd be able to pick the right strain for that. And so that's why we also prioritize having a wide range of average attenuations in our strains. We have strains with low attenuation, we have strains with high attenuation, so that you're able to actually match a strain to your brew house. And then, of course, biotransformation is important as well. The last thing I want is every beer under the sun being made with hops from 2 states in the U.S. And that's kind of the mess that we've got ourselves into. I'm not saying that it's the end of the world, but again, if everyone's making beer with the same yeast and the same 2 or 3 hops, then what makes it different? And I think that developing new yeast strains for specific flavor profiles and for biotransformation allows us to expand what type of hops get used as well. I'm not saying we'll ever be able to make a perfect hazy IPA with like SOTS hops, but at the very least, if you're able to use a yeast to get more aroma from the local Cascade Centennial, then that opens up some new possibilities to support your local farmers and also develop unique beers. So that leads to some new yeast options. So just to highlight a few that we've developed, sort of based on some of these principles, Hydra has been out for a few years now. It's definitely found its niche. That is a lower attenuating yeast. It actually works great in breweries that have a hard time controlling wort fermentability. If you don't have the ability to do a step mash or mash out, and so therefore you don't have much ability to control the fermentability of your wort, and you're still trying to look for that high finishing gravity, juicy result, it's a fantastic strain for that application. It's also haze positive and has a really nice flavor profile. Mango, especially if you combine it with some of those danker hops like Strata. So Hydra, even though it's been out for a few years, I think it's still got a lot of potential, and I'm hoping people pick it up and try it out. Pomona is definitely the new kid on the block. Just came out a couple months ago and has proven to be pretty popular because it's another new strain that is haze positive, and the hazy IPA does continue to show its dominance. And then this offers a different flavor profile. So as opposed to some of the like another haze positive strain like the Foggy London, it does offer a little bit more aroma. It offers a really nice peach stone fruity character. The goal for this strain was, can we make something like Vermont but with more haze? And I think we achieved that. Elysium is another new one. So that was released alongside Pomona. That's a hybrid with some Kvike genetics and Cerberus genetics. So that's the strain that offers a lot of efficiency, offers no quality risk, and really combining 2 strains that had really good production of the pineapple ester, which you can learn all about in our video on yeast flavor production. But breeding 2 strains with good pineapple ester production to really, really push that pineapple ester, I think that's really, really desirable in some IPA styles. And one opportunity here with Elysium is it is not haze positive. You can make a hazy beer with it, but it's not going to contribute haze in the way that some other yeasts will. So that also can be a pretty good yeast for West Coast. You can make a pretty clear IPA with Elysium. And if you've got hops that are, maybe on the more dank and resiny side, adding that pineapple note from the yeast can actually really help push that fruitiness. So there's a lot of opportunities, I think, with Elysium, especially as we get into, are we going to see some more clearer, lighter IPAs out there? And then Thio Libre as well. So Thio Libre has been out for a little while now, a couple years almost. It has gone through, one update earlier this year. So another great option. And really, if you're looking to push biotransformation, this is a pretty impressive strain. You can get pretty strong thiol biotransformation from that strain and show, what is the hidden potential in my malt, in my hops, especially when using, local hops or leftover Cascade or whatever you've got. It's a really good way to show off that thiol enhancement. And if you can balance that with It's nice to balance that with hops that are also terpene forward and get a really nice flavor profile. But it does really help produce that thiol guava white wine note in a beer. And based on the success of um, thiol producing yeasts and thiol enhanced beers, I think that approach is here to stay. And as brewers learn more and more, we're going to see a lot more of those on the market. Another option to consider, I'm going to stop my sales pitches after this slide for a bit. I'm also just trying to provide as much, options and education here. House ale or dry yeast, please consider it for your West Coast. I think it's awesome. We basically designed this yeast to be better than the existing options on the market for making your clean, dry, American style beers. And I think that it achieves that. It's quite efficient fermentation. If you try it, up against whatever you're currently using, if you're using a dry strain, we tend to find that it will compare favorably. So make sure to give it a shot. It's really efficient. If you need to get beer out the door quickly, it's a great option. If you don't want to, have to worry too much about off flavors or weird esters, it's also a great option. Super, super clean. So if you're looking for that classic West Coast IPA where you don't have a ton of yeast character in the mix, it does work really well. And I did want to highlight, just one example of using the house ale in a pale ale kind of beer. You can see here is just something that I want to highlight because diacetyl is such an issue with these kinds of beers and hop creep compared to a different dry strain. This strain does have faster diacetyl cleanup. So if you're finding that you're having issues specifically with diacetyl cleanup in a dry hops beer using dry yeast, I would encourage you to try this one out. It does seem to be pretty easy to use. There's other options also for addressing diacetyl with hop creep in IPAs. Which leads us into yeast nutrition. So this is a really important topic as well that I do want to cover. You can go and watch our full video on yeast nutrition as well. We've got lots and lots of information in there that should help you understand why yeast, needs all sorts of different types of nutrients and how it benefits. But the long story short is that poor yeast health will lead to a number of issues with IPAs. Number one, FAN is required for proper yeast growth and harvesting. Since most IPAs are fairly high gravity beers and don't have a huge amount of sugar or adjunct, FAN is usually not the issue, although sometimes it can be. Zinc can help a lot to reduce the timeline of hop creep and VDK reduction. And that's something that I've heard some other people preaching as well. Making sure that your wort has enough zinc in it, which can be easier said than done. Because if you're adding zinc as a zinc sulfate to the kettle, for example, you're probably losing most of it to the trub when it whirlpools. So you have to be strategic about how you add your zinc and keep that in mind. Otherwise, it will tend to lead, zinc deficiency will lead to longer hop creep, higher residual diacetyl, all these challenges that make IPA a pain. Magnesium is something to watch for as well with nutrition. If you're adding really high calcium chloride rates, which is common in hazy IPAs, it can change the mouthfeel, body of the beer, make it feel more soft. If you're adding a ton of calcium, you're basically limiting the ability of the yeast to take up magnesium. And magnesium is important for yeast cell growth. It's important for alcohol tolerance. So not having enough magnesium can cause some problems. And what we found with, sometimes brewers producing IPAs, having slow ferments, stalled ferments, stuck ferments, adjusting the magnesium can help a lot. And another thing to keep in mind is that vitamins are important. So the B vitamins, for example, things like biotin, thiamine, riboflavin, those are needed for optimal performance by many common IPA strains. Many of the IPA strains have what I would call pretty wacky genetics. They have some pretty strange mutations that don't make sense because why would you forget how to make biotin? But some of them have these weird mutations and they need help. We need to give them the vitamins that they need. Otherwise, you get some strange results. So that's something to keep in mind as well. If you are looking for a complete yeast nutrition solution, you can always check out our Yeast Lightning. It's just growing in popularity, and we've got a lot of really positive reviews on that. It seems to be helping people quite a lot. Okay, we're going to keep talking about yeast in the IPA. Harvesting and repitching is another thing to keep in mind. I've also got a little bit more here on the dry hop timing. So something I want to highlight here is that if you're not harvesting and repitching yeast, you're basically on the professional side and even on the homebrew side, you're kind of just leaving money on the table. Like it's great for yeast companies if you're not harvesting and repitching, but at the end of the day, we want to make sure that your costs are in check and that you're operating efficiently. So, we're not offended by anyone repitching, and in fact, we encourage it because a lot of times you're going to get more. As the yeast adapts to your specific fermenters, you'll get sometimes improved results in those middle generations. Although we always try to target good performance from that first generation. Something to keep in mind if you are dry hopping mid ferment, one of the limitations there that we talked about earlier is that it makes it real hard to harvest yeast. So if you don't, I would just run some tests. If you don't see a huge difference from pushing your dry hop from the middle to the end, then you should do it because it's going to make it a lot easier to harvest yeast. Something to also highlight is that dry hop timing does impact the yeast dependent haze. So there's some great research from Omega Yeast to highlight there. So you can just see the visual on the screen where if the beer is dry hopped earlier on in the process, it actually goes clear versus if the dry hops are added later on, the beer stays hazy. So if you're having haze issues and you're dry hopping mid ferment or earlier, that might be a root cause of your haze issues. As we said before, there's limited evidence for the mid fermentation dry hopping impacting the actual sensory profile of the beer. So, my recommendation is try dry hopping later so that you can crop your yeast. Crop your yeast, reuse it. That's also going to help you if you're on, pitching cheap dry yeast every single time. This is the way that you're going to be able to afford a wider selection of high quality yeast, whether that's, dry or liquid. That's how you do it. You repitch a yeast a few times and all of a sudden, the cost looks a lot different. And some yeasts are easier to crop early. So if you are looking to crop yeast really, really early, I would steer you toward a Kvike yeast or a English Ale 2. Both work really, really great for that application. And if you want to learn more, because this is a big topic, harvesting, repitching, cropping yeast, we do have some videos that you can watch on our YouTube for that as well. Controlling haze. So we just did a full video on this, so you can go and watch that on YouTube. But just the Coles notes here are watch your dry hop rate. You need a lot of hops to get that like orange juice haze in most cases. Consider the impact of dry hop timing. It does seem like late dry hops tend to be more haze positive. Yeast strain does impact haze. Some strains will basically add haze or haze stability. Some don't really impact it. Some may even be haze negative if they break down the protein in the beer. You can add haze through adjuncts like hop haze. You can also remove haze through finings. So if you're making a West Coast IPA or IPA that you want to be clear, you have the opportunity of using finings. Just you have to keep in mind that you need to match your finings to whatever it is you're trying to find out of the beer. And we had some information on that in this beer haze video as well. And then getting into off flavors. So again, we're really just talking, focusing here on what does yeast do in the IPA and how do we make the best modern IPA. One that we encounter a lot, both in finished beer and also in troubleshooting, is acetaldehyde. In IPA, when you have these other flavors from the hops, acetaldehyde comes off as melony. It comes across like cantaloupe or like a freshly cut melon, more so often than like the green apple kind of thing that you might get from it in a lager. So keep in mind that off flavor sensory perception can be context specific. So if you've got an IPA and it's got like a weird melony flavor and you don't like it, that's what this is. It's acetaldehyde. It's incomplete fermentation. It's caused by the yeast not having enough resources to complete production of alcohol. So you have to, the solution is to make sure that that yeast has proper nutrition, especially zinc, especially oxygen for growth. And then also another thing to watch out for is that repeatedly overpitching the yeast can also lead to incomplete fermentations or acetaldehyde issues, because you're just basically making the yeast cells older and older and older over each generation. And then the other big one is diacetyl, especially now with hop creep, and if the yeast is not healthy going into that dry hopping phase, it's probably going to struggle and create some diacetyl. So at the end of the day, that's caused by poor yeast health, as well as the yeast not having enough amino acids. So that can be caused by underpitching or poor oxidation. It can also just be caused by making the yeast do another fermentation after it's already done a fermentation, which can be what goes on with hop creep. So how do we control it? We got to make sure the yeast is healthy. That helps a lot. You don't need enzymes like ALDC, although those are a pretty fantastic solution as well. Relatively affordable ALDC enzyme. If you're really worried about diacetyl, you can add that to your wort. I've also heard of brewers adding that in right with their dry hop addition as well to reduce the risk of diacetyl production. And if you're in the US, there are also some yeast strains that make ALDC themselves as well. So that can be a pretty elegant solution. And, craft beer is partially art, partially craft, but also it's an industry, and we have to make products that are consistent. So do not discount process aids. There's a lot of really cool stuff out there. I'm not even covering the advanced hop products here, which are really cool. There's some other process aids that can help you dial in the consistency and quality of your IPA. So I just want to highlight a few. There's hop haze adjustment products. Like, it's not going to get you the whole way to like orange juice, but they can really help with adding a little bit of haze and stability. So there's products from companies like Haas and TNS. I'm sure there's more as well that I'm not aware of. There's also some products coming on the market or on the market for adjusting body in these beers. So especially if we're looking at, beers that are going lighter, once you're getting down to the 4% range, or even getting into like the non-alcoholic range, this can really help. But even in regular beers, a common scenario is hop creep, making an IPA ferment further, attenuate more than you intended, and then it ends up a little bit too dry and astringent than what you had hoped. There are products out there that can help you. So this one, ISY Enhance, we're giving a trial to. I've heard of another product called Fibersol. I'm sure there's going to be more available that can help you to adjust that final body in the beer, which I think is a lot of promise as well, because sometimes we just can't predict hop creep. And just to highlight the impact of yeast-dependent haze, this is just an example in wort this is not dry hopped. So keeping in mind that most of the haze that we get in a hazy IPA is protein and polyphenol from the malt and the hops, but yeast does have some contributions. So if you're trying to keep your beer clear or hazy, keep in mind that the yeast strain will have an impact. So you can, now that some more of the science has been defined, you can select yeast based on whether it's haze positive or whether it's haze neutral. So if you're looking to select a yeast for haze, I apologize, this is slightly out of order. You can select yeast like Hydra and Pomona, and then of course the old classic Foggy London Ale remains exceptionally popular for hazy IPAs. And the reason for that is that it's the easiest strain to make a hazy IPA with, although there's new options on the market, and I'm sure there'll be more as time goes on as well, where you can explore yeast that can make it easy to get that stable haze for those New England IPAs, while also exploring different flavor profiles. So that leads us to a lot of options. I just thought I would throw up a little comparison chart here. We can put this on our website as a download as well, but there's a lot of options for what I'll call the modern IPA. Going from California Ale, like the most classic, to some of these brand new strains like Pomona and Elysium. You have a lot of options to play around with, and I'm excited to see brewers experimenting with different yeast strains and different processes, local hops, local malts. There's a lot of really cool stuff, I think, that's happening, both in professional breweries and also in home brewing. A lot of people playing around and experimenting, and I think that's exciting because that's what's going to push this forward, experimentation, right? Um, I'll say it again: we can't all make beers with the same yeast and Citra and Mosaic. We've got to change it up and offer something different and new. And I think that through both yeast and through other techniques and ingredients, we have the opportunity to do that with IPA. And who knows what the next Juice Force, Juicy Ass, whatever is going to be, but whoever comes up with that is probably going to have a lot of benefits in the market. You've got a lot of things to play around with. You can, don't sleep on Kvike, don't sleep on some of the old school strains, but consider some of these new strains out there because they can do some really, really cool things for you. I've been drinking a few beers with Pomona and Elysium lately, sent to us by some of the brewers who picked them up right away, and I've been really, really impressed. I kind of said this about Thio Libre as well, but these things are just making IPAs more exciting, and I think that's I'm excited to see what you guys come up with. So what else? Really, I just focused on the yeast. I've tried to be upfront about that. The IPA is really about the hops, but yeast does play a really important supporting role here. There's a lot to consider in terms of process that we didn't get into. I've seen some things in the comments as well. So I do recommend checking out other resources, especially scientifically backed resources like New IPA is an awesome resource, I think. Definitely check out that that book. If you make IPA, you should probably have a browse through that because it's going to help you understand what you're doing a lot better. So definitely recommend that. And there's a lot of really, really good resources out there, both Scott Janish's blog and some of the other blogs out there as well. And also you can check out our resources. So we do have lots of information on our knowledge base. There's a lot of IPA specific troubleshooting and knowledge information on the Escarpment Labs knowledge base. YouTube as well. So I just talked about a bunch of our different YouTube videos in this webinar because this webinar really ties together a lot of those different themes. So you can go and check out our content. This whole series is uploaded on YouTube, along with more, a huge amount of knowledge to help you be a better brewer. And also our blog. So if you're looking for some written word, we've got some information there, including a lot of information on yeast cropping, repitching, IPAs, biotransformation, all sorts of relevant stuff. So make sure to check that out. And happy flocking holidays from Escarpment Labs. I'll be sticking around to answer some questions for a little bit. So make sure if you do have any questions and you are watching here live, put those in the chat and I'll be happy to give you some answers. And if you're watching on YouTube, you can always ask a question in the comments. We tend to check those and post some responses, and it's really cool to see what people have to say and have to ask. Really great to see that people are watching these videos through to the end. And so thank you for watching along. If you've been watching this whole series, thank you for making this far and spending the time with me. I really, really appreciate that. And I hope we've brought you value. I hope we've brought you useful information that's helping you to be a better steward of yeast and a better brewer. Okay, so I'm going to answer a couple questions here. So this one's from Jacob. Is there any benefit to implementing a protein rest to favor specific molecular weight proteins to promote a stable haze? Jacob, that is a fantastic question. I don't know the answer to that. Because, yeah, like a certain protein size, and we talked about this in the Haze talk, there is a certain size of protein or molecular weight, which is a fancy way of saying size, to get that stable haze. That is known. In terms of then reverse engineering how much of a protein rest to favor that is tricky because you have a lot of other variables at play. You have the malt itself, which can change seasonally. You have the brew house, which some might heat up faster than others or have hot or cold spots. It's tricky, I would say, is the answer here. I don't know if it's very, very helpful. I would plan to build in protein in other ways if you can get it without a protein rest. And I know that a lot of folks do, because there's a lot of brewers making IPAs with stable haze that aren't doing step mashing at all. I would do it that way, although I'm sure this could be done. I have another question. How do you separate the hops from the yeast, especially with so much dry hopping? Yeah, that's like the $1,000,000 question, to be honest, because if you are dry hopping earlier in the process, it's pretty much impossible to crop the yeast, because you really don't want to crop hoppy yeast. You know, the hops can really, really mess with the cell surface of the yeast. And if you repitch really hoppy, yeast slurry that has a lot of like hop particulate mixed in with it, it tends to get pretty weird in subsequent generations. Like you can see some issues with attenuation, growth, flocculation, all sorts of weirdness. So unfortunately, the solution, if as long as you're happy with the flavor, is to crop the yeast first and then dry hop, or just crop what you need. One approach that I can suggest would be crop thin slurry earlier on, enough yeast to pitch into your next batch, but maybe not all of it, so that you're leaving some yeast in to deal with the biotransformation, or any biotransformation with dry hopping, although it might be minimal, and certainly to at least deal with the enzyme activity and the hop creep. So that's one option. Another one I've heard of is brewers using centrifuges for dropping out the yeast or dropping out the hops. That obviously gets a lot more expensive. Looks like we're pretty much wrapped up here. So once again, have a happy holiday break. I'm gonna be signing off of these webinars for a little while. If you have any suggestions for what you want to see us talking about in 2024, let us know, and we'll make sure that that's on our roadmap. We really love doing this type of education, and if you can, check out some of the Escarpment Labs yeasts and throw us some support. We've been Canada-wide for about 8 years now. Starting to ship to a lot of US states, Europe, Japan. So, if you want to work with us, don't hesitate to reach out. Would love to hear what you're working on and see how we can help you. Cheers.